Sociology and women's studies professor Gail Dines presents her research on pornography's social, cultural, and economic impact in America. Politics and Prose Bookstore in Washington, D.C. hosts this half-hour talk.
These things are never built for 5-foot women, you know. So first of all, thank you everyone for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really thrilled that you came. So I want to start with where I was 2 years ago. I was in this huge hall and I was surrounded by pornography, hardcore pornography. And you could barely hear yourself think because of the fake orgasm sounds coming from the pornography. And I'm standing there thinking, how did a nice Jewish girl from Manchester, England get here? And that's a question that many people ask me. How did you end up doing what you do? And if somebody would have told me I was going to be the expert on pornography, right, I didn't think I was going to go there. So let me tell you what happened. I was living in Israel at the time and I was working at the Rape Crisis Centre. I was 22 years old and writing a dissertation for my doctorate. And somebody came up to me and said to me, there's an anti-porn feminist slideshow. Do you want to come? And I'd never really thought about pornography before, and I was 22, what did I know? So I said, okay. Little did I know that night it was going to completely change my life. I couldn't believe the images I was seeing. I literally couldn't believe them. And not only could I not believe that men made these images, I couldn't believe that other men found them arousing. And it was such a shock to me. And I know I talked about misogyny and woman hating, but there's nothing like actually seeing those images up there to deliver the message to you. So that night I went home, I called my advisor and I changed my doctorate topic. And I actually did the doctorate on sociology of media with the special case of pornography. And from that day on, this has tethered me. I'm not going anywhere with this. As long as there's a porn industry, I'm going to be here. So let me tell you about what happened in Israel. An incredible thing happened to me. I'd gone there believing in Zionism and thinking this was a homeland for Jews. And then I got to have to basically counsel Jewish women who'd been raped by Jewish men. I also had to counsel Jewish women who'd been battered by Jewish men and Jewish girls who'd been raped by their fathers. And I began to think, is this really a homeland for Jewish women? Because the same violence against women that goes on in other places goes on here. And then it kind of all coalesced one day. I'm walking down the main street in Tel Aviv, and there's a big porn image flapping in the wind, and it's a woman on her knees giving a man oral sex with Hebrew everywhere. And I thought, the last time a Jewish woman was shown publicly on her knees like that was probably in Nazi Germany, where they made pornographic images of Jewish women. And I went up to the guy and I said to him, there's a law against this, and I'm now going to go to the police and I'm going to get you arrested. Of course, there was no law, right? So they just said that in the hope I'd get him to take it down. And he looks at me, this man. Now, this is a man who's never done women's studies, hasn't got a PhD in media, and he looks at me and he says to me, I know why you don't like that picture. He said, that's you, isn't it? That's you up there. And I thought, yes, you are absolutely right. Of course it's me. As a woman, of course it's me, because that's the reality of pornography. We're all up there, vulnerable and into pornographic gaze. So I went home and I started doing a sociology of media doctorate. And I approach pornography as one would approach any form of media, which is that, how do media images affect us? How do they impact on the world that we live in? And of course, anyone who's progressive politically talks about the role of the media in an unequal society, how the fact that a few have access to most of the resources, and how do we legitimize that? How do we normalize that through a media? And so what I began to realise when I was reading media studies was, if people say images have an effect, if people say they construct reality, then surely pornography is going to do the same thing. Surely pornography is going to construct the reality of men. Because how can you walk away from these images unchanged? And as I always say, pornography delivers patriarchal ideology to men via the penis, which is an extremely successful delivery system. So what I'm looking at here is how images shape the reality. And I'm going to take you through when I was at in Las Vegas at the Adult Video News Awards. And they have a big expo there, and thousands of fans, porn fans, descend on that place. And there was thousands of fans and me. So I'm walking around there, and at first I stop and interview some of the porn producers. And one man talks to me and tells me how he's doing something different. He's not making pornography, his stuff is different. And I look behind me, and he's got a picture, basically an image of a woman kneeling in a coffin as she's being anally penetrated. And I said, the coffin? And he said, well, maybe the coffin's not so good. And so when we walked around and round, and I talked to these people, what I got was the same message over and over again, that they do not know where this industry is going. They do not know how they got to do what they do. They are absolutely amazed that there has been no law or very few lawsuits against them. And they can't believe they're making this amount of money. And I was walking around there looking at all of this pornography and, you know, exhausted and demoralized. And I sat down next to an African American woman who was doing security, the security guard. And I started to talk to her, and she wouldn't talk to me. And she thought I was a pornographer, and she was having nothing to do with the pornographers. So I had to tell her, no, I'm not a pornographer, I'm actually a feminist, anti-pornography, I'm writing a book. And eventually she opened up to me, and she told me, she said, you know, I have never seen pornography before. Nobody told me I was going to have this as my detail. And I have got a cring in my neck because I am looking down and cannot stand to look at the pornography. And I looked around, and indeed, most of the security guards were African-American women. And then she says to me, you know, I've been divorced 2 years and I can't find a good man, and now I understand why. I never knew it before. And then just as she says that, an African-American woman walks by, one of the women from the pornography industry, and she's dressed in the usual garb, which means not very much. And Patricia, the African-American woman, I call her Patricia, she taps me on the shoulder and she says, go and tell her it's not good for her. Go and tell her this isn't right. And as she does that, a fan comes up to the African-American porn performer and puts his hand on her crotch. She smiles, everyone takes a picture, and Patricia just groans. And there she was, plotting her exit as far away from Las Vegas as possible. So when I got home and tried to make sense of this, I began to go through some of my notes. And, you know, some of it is actually quite humorous, although it's not really funny. For example, I went up to a store where they have what's called real dolls. Anyone heard of real dolls? These are these anatomically correct dolls which are worth thousands of dollars. I think there's a 6-month waiting list. I know there's a waiting list. You can choose exactly what size breasts, what colour pubic hair, what lipstick. You get to choose all of that. And I went up to the guy who was behind the desk there, and I said, you know, I'm interviewing people, I'm a journalist, I'm writing a book. And I said, so why do men buy these dolls? He said, well, you know what? He said, they really help men develop relationships with women. So this is what he's telling me. And then he says, but you know what? He says, a lot of women also buy them for their husbands. And I said, so why do you think that is? He says, oh, because these women want lesbian experiences. Yes, this is a lesbian experience with a doll, right? And then what he said to me, which is so interesting, because this tells you something about the industry. I said to him, did you actually see Lars and the Real Girl? Has anyone seen that movie? And he said, not only did I see it, he said, we consulted for it. He said, and the day it came out, our website crashed. That's how popular it was. So you can see the meshing of the industry with mainstream pop culture. So what I'm going to do is give you sort of a brief introduction to my book and show you what I actually wrote about. And I start by walking people through the porn industry. And I do that for a very specific reason. Because many women, especially, and older men, they can't understand why I'm so upset by just a collection of pictures of women in a cornfield smiling with no clothes on. Well, of course, that's not what pornography is today, but that's the image that a lot of people have. So what I have to say is I'm upset because pornography today looks nothing like that. And that was bad enough in its sexism and objectification, but we have now taken it to a completely different level. So what I do is I explain the acts in pornography, I go through the different sites, and I talk about the body punishing sex, the cruelty, the violence, the degradation, the debasement. I talk about some of the sex acts, and I'll give you an example of the debasement. One's called ATM, ass to mouth, where the man takes his penis and puts it in a woman's anus and then immediately into her mouth without washing. Now, what sexual arousal is there outside of the debasement of the woman? Because can you think of what's more sexually aroused than that? So what I look at is how pornography, how the sizzle in pornography, how what makes it hot is in fact the debasement of women. So I go through the different sites and I walk people through. And the question is, you know, what effect is this going to have on society? Because the first age of downloading downloading pornography for children is 11 years old. So think about this: 11-year-old boys, the first entree into sex is pornography. And it's not your father's Playboy. It's that hardcore body-punishing sex. So the question is, what effect is this going to have on young boys whose sexuality is still developing, who don't even own their sexuality yet, and before they own it, they give it to the pornographers? And so think about, we're in a new world here, because it used to be that generations of boys would grow up, they would be, have hormones raging, they'd go and find their father's Playboy, and they'd have limited access to the Playboy. Today, it's anonymous, it's affordable, and it's accessible 24 hours a day. And so what we're talking about is bringing up a generation of boys on images that we have never before brought them up on. Now, people say, what's going to be the effect of this? Well, we don't know, because we're in the middle of a social experiment. And it's an experiment, I bet, that most of you never signed on to. But we're going to have to wait and see. But I can begin to tell you what some of the effect is, given the men I've interviewed, which is in the book. The interviews, I really talk to men and ask them about their pornography use. And I do it kind of open-ended so that they get to talk rather than me directing them what they should be talking about. And a lot of them now are very interesting, because I've been doing this for over 20 years. And I used to get an incredible amount of anger and defensiveness, and they would fight with me. And now I don't see that. And what's really strange is how they have actually stopped being defensive and angry, and now they feel anxious about their pornography use. They feel there's something not right in it. And I'll give you an example. I gave a lecture in a huge hall in a northeastern university, and a woman stands up and says, why are men using pornography? What's wrong with them? Why do they do it? And I said, well, rather than ask me, let's turn to the men in the room and talk to them. And one guy gets up and he said, I feel like I'm going to faint, I'm so anxious, but I have to tell you my story. And then he tells a heartbreaking story of his habitual use to pornography. And then he sits down, and then other men start standing up, telling their stories. And I get this now over and over again, of men who thought they could go to pornography, thought that when it's done, they zip up their pants, they zip up their head, and it's all over. No, those images leak into the real world. And what they tell me is, first of all, that the more pornography they use, the more they expect their sex in their real lives to look like the pornography. And they get a shock, because it's not like that. Because pornography is what I call industrial strength sex. And most women will not do that. They will simply not allow the men to do those acts to them. So these men get very upset, they get very angry, they don't understand why they've seen thousands of women do these things, why won't this one lying next to him do it? Also, what they find is that a lot of them lose interest in sex. It looks boring and banal. And what they do is they prefer their pornography to sex with another human being. And I've just interviewed a woman whose husband is in his 20s, she's in her 20s, not had sex for months. Why? He's addicted to pornography. And this is one of the results that happen. Another thing that happens is men find that they cannot ejaculate without pulling up images of their favourite porn star. And they feel bad about this, because they want to be present during sex. They don't want to be thinking of the pornography. Or they have to pull up their favourite scenes. So this is having a really big effect on the young men. Now, what about the women? Well, a lot of the women I interview talk about being pressured into porn sex by their boyfriends and by their hookups. Because I don't know if most of you know what's going on in college campuses today, but there's very little dating and there's lots of hookup sex, which are actually, hookup sex is porn sex. It's sex with no intimacy, it's sex with no connection, it's sex with no empathy. So what you have is really hookup sex being porn sex, which is being played out on all the campuses. Studies show, by the way, that the more hookup sex girls get involved in and young women, the more they're depressed, the lower their self-esteem. What studies show for boys is the more hookup sex they do, the higher their self-esteem. So you can see who this is working for, right? Not to mention, of course, that women get much fewer orgasms during hookup sex. Surprise, surprise, okay? So what happens, the young women tell me, is they feel pressured to do these things and they don't want to do them, and yet they're being told from Cosmopolitan, they're being told from Sex and the City, everywhere they go they're getting the message that pornography is okay, lighten up, it's fun, don't be a prude. And so they have got no alternative ideology with which to come at these men and to say no and to explain why they're not. So another thing that the women tell me, which is very interesting, is how they feel like from the word go, living in a hypersexualized society, they have felt that they have to become sexual beings very early on. Because as they wander around the culture looking for images of themselves, of femininity and what it means to be a woman, the only image they get is this hypersexualized image. And we all know what it looks like, you know, white, young, blonde, thin, low-slung jeans, tramp stamp in the back, you know, pierced navel, all of these things. And this is what they get over and over again. Now, I think for those of us over the age of 35 or even over the age of 30, when we were growing up trying to figure out what it meant to be a woman, we had lots of choices. Not enough, of course, because we needed the feminist movement to expand our choices. But I remember thinking, you know, what fitted for me? What kind of identity as a woman made sense for me? And I had images to choose from that were not just the hypersexualized images. Today, those images have crowded out alternative images of being female. And what you have is women saying they choose this, but in reality, you can only choose something if you've got an array of choices in front of you. And increasingly, those choices are being limited because basically in our society, you can be visible or invisible as a woman. And what kid wants to be invisible? And you will be invisible if you don't look hypersex like your friend. And this is why there's this kind of push towards hypersexualization. So this is also what I hear from the girls and the young women. So basically, we have now women being socialized into hypersexualization, and we have boys being trained through pornography what sex looks like. No wonder there's that hookup sex. No wonder there's rape in hookup sex as well, which is what the studies are showing, that more women get raped in hookup sex than any other connection or relationship. So these are the key issues I talk about. I also look at racism in pornography, which very few people actually have ever looked at. Now, what's interesting is 1 in 4 films released to the market is called interracial. And this is a black man and a white woman. And this is geared to white men. So the question becomes, why do white men want to watch black men penetrate white women over and over again? And I was really thinking about this because, you know, it's not that long ago that black men got lynched for even the threat of such a thing. So what's going on? And then it dawned on me, if indeed pornography is about the debasement of women, what better way in a racist society to debase a white woman than have her penetrated over and over again by a body that has been marked as demonized, has been seen as deviant, i.e. the black male body? Because the history of racism in this society is the history of the demonization of black sexuality. And so what you see in pornography is the hypersexualization and the eroticization of racism, which has a profound effect on communities of colour. So I go into the image of African American women, the image of African American men, I go into the image of Asian women and Asian men, and I really look at what it means to have white skin in the pornographic industry versus skin of colour. So those are some of the issues that I talk about. I'm sure people have got some questions and issues and things you'd like to bring up. So rather than me just go on, I'm going to open it up to some questions.
So I'll start by way of introducing my question by noting that in Shakespeare there's a lot of sex and violence, but I don't mention that to endorse those things, but to mention that Shakespeare is with us today. The Drek he must have been competing with probably had plenty of it too, but was Drek and forgotten. And so I ask about your reference to all these video games. How do you avoid being accused of being a garden variety moral panic person who's talking about how pinball and Elvis and the Beatles are going to ruin our nation as well?
Okay, good question. Okay, because we always say, you know, every generation has said, oh, this is the end of the world, you know, the younger generation, just terrible. But let me tell you, we have never done this before. We have moved from a print-based culture to an image-based culture, where the main form of communication is the image. Now the image is increasingly pornographized. So the question becomes, what does that mean for boys to grow up in that? And I would say we are in serious, serious trouble. And I don't think we've ever been in a situation like that. And also to talk about moral panics, and one thing people often call me is say, are you a prude? Well, let me say something. If I was speaking against fast food industry, if I was talking about the obesity and the health issues with fast food, would anyone accuse me of being anti-eating? So why, when I talk about pornography, am I accused of being anti-sex? It's the same thing. Pornography is the industrialization and commodification of sex. It's not sex. Just as fast food is not just food, it's the commodification and industrialization of it. So what I'm talking about is an industry, specifically an industry. So this is not an issue about being a moral panic or being a prude. It's an issue about a huge industry that is having an enormous impact on our culture.
I was wondering if you've done any work with Professor Catherine McKinnon, or if you've worked with her, well, heard of her. She's very well known. Could you comment on that?
Yes, quite a while ago actually, we brought the Dworkin-McKinnon legislation to Boston. And we try to, basically it defines pornography as a violation of women's civil rights, or anyone's civil rights who's harmed in it. So we brought that to Boston. I have to tell you, I have a kind of progressive understanding of capitalism. Never, though, have I seen the forces of capitalism marshal itself against a piece of legislation. Even the guy who was running the hearings, who had been a long time, assistant and aide to the rep, said he had never seen anything like the onslaught against this bill. He said not even the insurance industry is this bad. So, I mean, that's the kind of stuff, that's what happened when we worked with, Catherine McKinnon and the late Andrea Dworkin. Thank you. Hi.
I was reading Common Sense a second ago, and I was thinking, what would Payne think about this? Essentially, from a girl from Manchester, I mean, I would like to know your perspective on how you think, at least, well, there used to be a bridge between America and Europe, and now that bridge seems to be ever closer. The discrepancy seems to be closer together. And I was thinking to myself, do you see, with the proliferation of the internet, mass communication, all these things, do you see the bridge coming closer together? And what do you think the effects?
You mean of the countries coming together?
Well, at least our thoughts on sexuality towards it.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because what pornography does is it universalizes the way we think about sex, because the internet is everywhere now, and pornography is one of the most downloaded, as you know. It's one of the most sought after images on the internet. So I would say that even cultural differences, cultural divides are now breaking down thanks to this sort of generic, plasticized, formulaic image of sex, which is what pornography is. So I think the divisions you're going to see a lot less. Yes, thank you.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Actually, I have a few, but I'll just ask two. The first is more about how you were able to talk to people in the industry themselves and have them open up about this, because to me, I'm thinking they would want to guard their thoughts. If you're an outsider whom they may already sense is sort of against their industry, how did you get them to open up?
You know what's really interesting is when I was there at the expo, it's 3 days long, and you know what? They were bored. They were just simply bored, and I would go and talk to them. They'd say, come and sit down. They'd be thrilled to talk about it. It was amazing. I went through notebook after notebook taking notes. And just to say what I didn't say is, interesting, I got an email last week from one of the porn producers I interviewed, and he said he'd read my book. I'm one of the porn producers, and I want you to know you're exactly right. He said, I've left the porn industry. Everything you say about pornography is true. And at the moment, we're having conversations because he's telling me what really went on behind the scenes. And this was a man who made pornography for 15 years. So, yeah, that's that. And so they did open up.
And then just my second question is more about how do you talk to the men out there? We all have brothers, friends, guy friends that watch porn, see porn. How do you talk to them in a way that's not abrasive, because I'm sure they're going to be sensitive anyway if the whole point is that it demoralizes women? How do you talk to them so that they get your world and get where you're coming from, and
that's a really
hopefully
good
shift
question.
their way of being?
Well, I say to my students, look, you're not going to, if you're looking to date a guy, the chances of you finding a guy who's not used pornography is very, very low. But everyone's entitled to one mistake. That's fine, okay? But now you're dating him, and now you're talking about pornography and why you don't want him to use it, then he has to stop. What I say to women is you cannot be in a relationship with a man who is using pornography and it be an equal one. Because pornography is about the inequality between women and men. Now, how do you do it? You have to talk to them. There's lots of stuff. There's a group that I belong to called Stop Porn Culture. And if you go to stoppornculture.com, there's lots of resources on there, lots of articles. And you need to basically introduce the men in your life to a critical analysis of pornography. Because many men have never thought critically about it, because when they look at pornography, they're aroused. and you try and have a rational discussion with an erect penis, it doesn't work, okay? So they need not to be aroused and to talk about it. So have a look for the resources on Stop Porn Culture. Yes, hello.
Hi, that was a very nice presentation. By listening to you, a scene came to my mind of an old movie, Last Tango in Paris.
Yeah.
And this is when Marlon Brando has many names to name the male organ, and most of those names are vulgar. So my question is, I'd like to know whether you think that pornography is I don't want to say collateral damage, spin-off of Western civilization and Christianity, with the idea that, you know, the sin, the sex as something that is, I think is similar to the question that the gentleman asked, but with a spin towards the cultural influence of Western, as I said, Christianity and our world.
Okay, I mean, you know, why have we got a porn industry? You can't, as a social scientist, I can't find one reason. There's multiple ways. I think one of our views about sex as being sort of dirty bleeds into pornography, because if you look at pornography, you know, sex is considered dirty in pornography. She is considered dirty. The names they always call her have got the word, you dirty whore, you dirty this, you dirty that. But I think what I try to say is, look, you know, we've probably always had pornography around us, but what's critical when we look at pornography is we have to look at it as an industry. And it began in 1953 with the first edition of Playboy. So what I'm interested in is less so in looking at sort of the vast, you know, issues out there, and really honing in on how the industry developed from 1953 to present day to understand how it functions. And it functions as all other industries do. So if you ask me why there's so much pornography around today, I would say because it has become a massive industry, because it is profit driven, because it exists within a capitalist market, and the goal of the pornographers, of course, is to make money. That's why you've got such a big industry, and the fact that it's delivered through the internet is crucial, because now it's so accessible. That changed the face of the industry.
As a follow-up, if I may, quick question: what's how many $1 billion a year is this?
They say, I mean, it's very hard to estimate, but one of the figures that's branded around a lot is $97 billion a year. 13 billion in America, 97 billion around the world. Thank you very much.
I'm interested in some of the questions that you posed. I got here a little late, so maybe you've already approached them, so forgive me. But one of the things you said was, what do men get out of ATM? Now, I'm wondering, did you interview men who said, yes, I practice that, and find out what they do get out of it? One question. Go ahead.
Let me answer that, and then I'll come back to another one. Okay, let me tell you that I haven't specifically interviewed men on that. What I did do is I went to the porn discussion boards, which is where the aficionados of porn hang out, basically, and I read what they were saying about ATM. And there is a thread called Messy ATM, and in this thread, hundreds and hundreds of postings talking about how great it is to watch the woman literally have to eat feces without knowing it, and how thrilling that was. And they even tell you at what point in the movie to go to so you can see her doing it, and that she didn't know it. And they said, one guy said, this was a moment of zen in pornography I've never reached before. So this is what they like, the debasement, if what they write is basically true.
I've heard when they make those films, they actually try to show you that it's ATM, but it isn't. It's A, and then clean up, and then. But I've heard that that is
no, they don't
not
try and
always,
clean up. No, they don't try and clean up in the films.
They create the. I've heard they create the impression that they're not.
Question, sir?
Yeah.
But the other question is, when you interview these people, it seems to me that you have to have a lot of controls to get anywhere close to the truth. The context in which you ask it, the how do you filter out whether people are just trying to appear to give the right answers as opposed to the real feelings that they have about something? I mean, it just seems to me that any psychological and sociological studies need a great deal of control to get anywhere close to the truth.
No, and of course, and obviously the more you interview and the more you begin to see patterns. I mean, as a sociologist, I look for patterns, and I began to look at patterns of what they were saying. I want to say as well, a lot of the research in here is actually from the porn industry itself, because I read Adult Video News, which is the trade paper of the porn industry, also XBiz, which is their business website. So I mean, it's not just through interviews, it's also through what they're talking about in their actual press. And I think what happens when you interview them, I have to say, a lot of them were really opened up about the industry. And what's good about when this guy contacted me, the producer, and said, you know, you were right, and we've had long conversations so far of an hour or so, and then we're going to have more, he's basically saying the same things I've heard over and over again. I've not heard anything different, so that's how I do. Thank you.
Just quickly,
Okay,
I don't think
I'm sorry, we need... Thank you.
Do you think it's possible to be a consumer of pornography and also have, you know, a quote-unquote healthy sexuality, whatever that might mean? And I'm wondering to what extent the pernicious effects of pornography are dependent on the more extreme types that you've discussed, because I've heard that, you know, there's supposedly a subset of the pornography industry that's supposed to be more friendly or appealing to women. So
let me tell you, the pornography I'm talking about is the most profitable on the internet. It's called Gonzo by the industry, and if the industry business website is to be believed, and if the adult video news is to be believed, then that's the most profitable, because that's the one men use alone. What they'll use with women more is what's called the features, which is kind of a story, and it tries to mimic the Hollywood movie, but it's still body punishing sex. I would say that if you are consuming pornography, what you are getting aroused to is the debasement and dehumanization of women. And I do not see how that can translate in any way into what I would say is a healthy relationship, which is one which is built on equality and respect. So I can't see how that would work. Thank you.
Maybe one or two more questions.
Yes, I just had a question. What's sort of your long-term strategy in the, you know, I don't know, war on porn, if you want to call it that, but like, are you trying to criminalize it or just sort of weed out the most offensive practices?
Okay, well, it's multi-pronged. One of the things we did with Stop Porn Culture is 3 of us wrote a anti-porn slideshow, which we give free of charge. You can download it from Stop Porn Culture. It comes with 100 images and 50-minute script. We give that out because we want people to start raising awareness and consciousness and doing an educational program about the harms of pornography. So one of the things we really want to do is raise public consciousness as to the harms of pornography. What I would also like to see at some point is to empower women, and anyone, indeed men as well, who have been hurt through the pornography industry at the point of either production or consumption, which means I'd like to see it in the criminal code, in the civil code, sorry, not the criminal code. I don't think the criminal code is the way to go for the pornographers, and it's not worked, because look at obscenity charges, it's not worked, and I think that women should be empowered especially to be the ones to go after the pornographers, because what we could say to them is, look, hey you remember that woman you bought for $50? Well, it's going to cost you a lot more than $50. Basically, we're saying women's lives matter and that we're going to put a price on them. Thank you.
After working for the feminist cause for many, many years, I'm still shocked that about 90% of the TV commercials, when they show cleaning products, is always a woman's hand cleaning. And so there's a sense that it's natural for women to clean and it's embarrassing for men to clean. Again, debasing women as the cleaners. Yeah. Again, you know, how do we mobilize both women and men to teach kids that, hey, it's okay for everyone to do these sorts of things, and it's not woman's natural job to clean or to be sexual in this, you know, terrible way, punishing way, and get to the media, you know, stop the commodification of the industry. Tell them we're mad about it. It's wrong.
Well, the only way I can see in all of these issues is we have to build a robust feminist movement. We cannot do this outside of feminism. And what I want to say very clearly, pornography didn't invent this ideology. Pornography is part of our culture. What comes out of what's in pornography is in the culture. That sort of woman-hating, anti-female position is not just something that pornography does. And when you see it in advertisements, when you see it in images everywhere, you're just seeing a lesser version of it. So that's what I'd say. And I think what we need to do, is my last comment, because we need to end, is to say, you know, this is a call, if this is a call for anything, is to join the feminist movement and to help us build an organization that resists the porn culture in general. Thank you very much.
Gail Dines is a sociology and women's studies professor at Wheelock College. She's also the editor of Gender, Race, and Class in Media and contributor to Pornography, the Production and Consumption of Inequality. For more information, visit gaildines.com. Join our conversation on the American Revolution